We would like to try to explain more broadly where the world is going.
Authoritarianism seems to be a kind of defining feature of the current conjuncture.
Mobilization of workers, but it's also a lot of politics of local communities.
Maybe hope is too big a word, but there are some important moves that are being made.
As a member of Mautsqebeli collective, I'm honored to introduce to our audience a special discussion, an interview with Sandro Mezadra, professor at Bologna University, whose two books, Politics of Operation, Excavating Contemporary Capitalism, and the newest one, The West and the Rest, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World, are going to be topics of today's conversation. For this opportunity, I have to say special thanks to friends of our organization and participants of today's discussion, Evelina Gambino and Lela Rekhviashvili. Evelina is a research fellow and lecturer in geography at the University of Cambridge. Lela Rekhviashvili is a researcher at Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography, political economist focused on post-socialist world. Before we go on, I would like to make a really short introduction of Georgia at the start of the spring 2025. So the country has been in an escalating political crisis from the start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. As some of us would see, Georgia is pressured by the interests of capital from every possible direction and is boiling in its internal class contradictions. Seems it is going through another round of self-determination. Since the Ukraine war, Georgia has started wavering between imperial powers struggling for regional domination. Country is imagined as part of a potential corridor or crossroad between EU and China or Russia and India. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the state has changed its mask from the builder of Western liberal democracy, led by the richest man of the country, to a state that calls for ultra-conservatism, has only one party in parliament, and is still led by the richest man of a country, whose power stands on a growing police force, growing repressive laws and propaganda of fear and hate. All of those who oppose the politics of the ruling party, party of capital, I would say, are called radicals, foreign agents, agents of global party of war, and people without a motherland. And this shift is done by the party in its 13th year in power. More than 100 days have passed since the start of the latest and biggest riots Tbilisi streets have seen. Event was labeled as another Euromaidan and a colored revolution by many, but in reality we may have been witnesses of the death of Georgia's liberal democracy, and it is growing into something more authoritarian. And all of this has to be seen as part of a global picture. And today we would like to try to explain more broadly where the world is going and how different societies should navigate to the new and hopefully brighter future. Here I will end, and I'm sure Lela and Evelina would like to add a bit more before we go to Sandro.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Georgi, for your introduction and also for inviting us to have this conversation. And thank you so much, Sandro, for joining us. So I think we can actually just delve directly into discussing the way in which this global conjuncture that you describe so aptly in your recent work actually can help us make sense about some of the things that are happening in Georgia right now. So I would like to start our conversation by defining the two central and intersecting ideas that emerge from your most recent work, Sandro, which are on one side the analysis of this emerging multipolarity, so this emerging multipolar order that we all live within, that you discuss in your book, the rest in the West with Brett Nielsen. And on the other side, a discussion of what you named together with Michael Hart, a global war regime. And I think, for all of us, the contours of this global war regime have become very apparent, especially in the past week. And if we think about, like the new arms race in Europe, the brutal and very extractive conditions laid out by the Trump administration for the peace deal in Ukraine. But also, the genocide in Gaza that's been going on for over 2 years now. And so I think, even to someone that is observing only, kind of from afar, like these intersections between the interests of capital and warfare are becoming quite clear. But I also do think that the geometries within which these intersections kind of manifest are not that apparent and kind of beget some thinking, especially if we want to start reflecting on how, as you say, this conjuncture hits the ground in a place like Georgia. So could you start by telling us, could you introduce your understanding of multipolarity and of a global war regime?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It is not only a pleasure to have this discussion, but it is also an important moment to test some of the hypotheses I've been developing with Brett Nielsen and Michael Hart over the last couple of years. You were talking about authoritarianism with respect to Georgia, and I think it is very easy to understand what you mean. It is important to be aware of the fact that authoritarianism seems to be a kind of defining feature of the current conjuncture. In many places of the world, we are confronted with a spread of political and social authoritarianism. Think of Europe, for instance. Think of countries with far-right governments like Hungary and Italy. Think of countries like France and Germany, where political development is kind of haunted by the rise of the far right. And then think, of course, of Trump in the US. The examples could be easily multiplied. So we have to ask some questions about the meaning of this widespread authoritarianism. And I think the way in which Brett and I understand multipolarity can help us to get at least some directions of thought. You know that multipolarity is a notion used today by several political leaders, including Vladimir Putin, to designate a kind of aim. Our use of the notion is completely different because we contend that at least since the financial crisis of 2007-2008, multipolarity is a good description of the state of the world. We add that the current multipolarity is a centrifugal and conflictual multipolarity, which means that it is not organized. It is rather the ground upon which tensions, conflicts, and even wars proliferate. The current state of multipolarity signals a disruption of the world system, if you wish. We are in a moment in history in which the very organization of the international and the world system is at stake. And I'm convinced that this stake builds the general framework within which also such devastating wars like the one in Ukraine and the one in Gaza can be and must be understood. To put it very quickly, and then we can discuss the notion of a global war regime tries to grasp the kind of possible management of the disruption of the world system in a moment in which there is no, let's say, order at the global scale. So with the notion of war regime, we do not simply refer to military confrontation. There are a lot of wars in the world, as we know, but even beyond these wars, the notion of war regime stresses the relevance of a whole set of processes that aim at reorganizing the economy and society according to the logic of so-called national security, which means to a military logics. So even trade wars, for instance, are part and parcel of the global war regime.
Yes, I mean, so this is exactly the thing you just said in terms of this constitutive nature of global, what you name a global war regime for not just military operation, but for economic transaction and economies. I think this is something that it's been very apparent from the perspective of Georgia already for a long time. And I think I want to contextualize what you're saying and start bringing this sort of down at a level that makes sense to Georgian politics specifically. I want to kind of bring three very, very, very quick examples which have to do with infrastructure. So one thing that is important to kind of highlight is the fact that for the past 30 years, so since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Georgia has been attempting to become a transit corridor. And so investment in infrastructure specifically has become foundational to not just Georgia's economy and Georgia's projected economy, but for Georgia's very sense of self as what role does Georgia have within the global order. And I think that interestingly, if we pay attention to the way in which different infrastructural projects actually came into existence or materialized, whether they actually function or not is a different question, we see not only the way in which a global war regime or the way in which there is a kind of intersection between practices of warfare and practices of logistics, but also the way in which the geometries within which this has kind of organized itself have shifted from the 90s. So I'm going to very quickly go through like three different projects, which are projects that I worked on. So the first one is this transnational infrastructure known as the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway. And this railway was firstly developed in the 90s, so in 1993, in the aftermath of the Nagorno-Karabakh war, so between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And this railway very specifically and explicitly aimed to isolate Armenia through logistical means, bypassing through Georgia. And so without going into the actual history of this infrastructure, what I want to point out is the fact that Georgia, in accepting to develop this infrastructure on this territory, very explicitly linked its economic development to the permanence of warfare elsewhere. So in its neighboring, amongst its neighborhoods, essentially. And then the other project, which is a very different project, is the port of Anaglia, which keeps, failing and then starting again. And this project, which was very, explicitly justified as an element of the Belt and Road Initiative, interestingly, during its development, was also rumored to be, a site where the U.S. naval fleet would become eventually moored. And this idea of this port as being essentially essential to national security and essential to larger geopolitical kind of organizations also implicitly justified the project. And I think you probably will discuss this with Lela later. And this idea, this geopolitical justification in many ways obscured the economic conditions of existence of this port. But then there is a third project, which I think is potentially the most interesting for us for the current moment, which is the North-South Corridor project. So this is a very long transnational highway that actually starts in Iran and ends in Russia. And Georgia has got the last segment of this highway. And this highway is the site from which you can really see the way in which the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has become a very essential productive element of Georgia's economy. Because in the aftermath of the invasion, of course, all of this cargo that used, or not all of it, parts of the cargo that used to pass through that corridor has been shifted through Georgia. And so what is happening is that actually, for the first time almost in 30 years, you have Georgia becoming a transit corridor for nothing necessarily of its own making, but because of this new conjuncture. And what has been happening on this corridor is that a series of different actors, some of which are transnational, some of which are national, some of which are institutional, some of which are not, are all rushing to capitalize on this flow of cargo, which is dependent on the war in Ukraine. So I think, these three different projects can give you a sort of snapshot of the different ways in which warfare and logistics, warfare and the economy have been intersecting, but also how they intersect in different geometries which are at once kind of heterogeneous and contradictory. So this is, I think, to ground this discussion within Georgia. And I wanted to hear either from you or from Lela, what kind of politics do you think, how do we face the politics that emerges from these complicated intersections of these two realms?
So maybe very quickly to start the discussion, it is a truism that logistics and infrastructures have always been crucial aspects of warfare. Modern logistics as we know, military origins. Nonetheless, I think it is important to stress that nowadays the strategic relevance of infrastructures in current wars has reached unprecedented levels. Think, for instance, of Gaza. Of course, you cannot reduce the war in Gaza, the genocidal massacre pursued by Israel in Gaza, to economic questions or to the issue of infrastructures. But you have to be aware of the relevance of this issue in the very framework of the war. Just think of the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that was launched as a project a couple of months before October 7, and that is continuously invoked by the Netanyahu government as the basis of what Netanyahu called last year at the UN General Assembly blessing. So if you reflect upon this question, you start to understand the relevance of infrastructures in current wars. Needless to say, also with respect to Ukraine, it would be easy to go into the details of the relevance of pipelines and routes for the distribution of gas, energy in the whole development of the war. For me, this relevance of infrastructures says something about contemporary capitalism and says something about what I was calling before the current disruption of the world market. Because all these infrastructures are key to the organization of the world market. Of course, the organization of the world market does not take place in the outer space. It is extremely localized, and it hits the ground in very specific, peculiar ways. So, in very general terms, I repeat, I think that we should make sense of the relevance of these infrastructural projects and of existing infrastructures from the point of view of attempts to reorganize the world market.
Yes, definitely. And I think at the same time, what you can see if you look at the specific projects from the kind of ground up, you see that these attempts end up being much more kind of fuzzy and kind of messy than they are kind of projected to be. And I think this is one thing that studying the different infrastructure became really apparent, is the role of things like, what you call the operation of capital. So, like financial agreements, for example, on one side, sustaining these relations, and on the other side, also kind of undermining the relations of, like the kind of different elements of this regime. I think maybe, Lela, you want to zoom in some of the different infrastructures now, also because I need to go and get some headphones because my laptop is very loud. So I'll be back in a second.
Yes, please. And actually, your laptop has not been so loud, but yeah, now that you turn off the mic, we can still hear. Sandro, thanks first of all so much for giving these broad definitions and explaining grounding concepts. I try to have brief questions, but I still see how there are a couple. And let me first address what does multipolarity can mean for peripheral economies like Georgia. There is various kinds of conceptualization of multipolarity, as you said. It already is conceptualized by certain political leaders. Also in academia, there is different understandings of it. And I would say one of the key debates that really regards also places like Georgia that are not just peripheralized, deeply peripheralized economies in relation to various hegemonic powers, but are also geopolitically very clumsily located, is whether multipolarity offers economic developmental opportunities or not. I can later share, of course, my opinions on this as well, but I wanted to tease out the response from you in regard to promises or fake promises of multipolarity for peripheralized and also, in Georgia's case, geopolitically very clumsily located economies and societies.
Yes, let me start by saying that for me, the concept of multipolarity is a kind of abstract concept, which means that it can take very different meanings. First of all, it attempts to grasp a situation in the world that is not only characterized by the crisis of US global hegemony, according to a diagnosis formulated already in the mid-1990s by Giovanni Arrighi, but also by the possible exhaustion of the very logics of hegemony in the international realm. And there are many reasons that make such an hypothesis highly plausible to me. I can speak of that if you want. But then the main point regarding multipolarity, always for me and Brett Nielsen, is that we must resist a unilateral geopolitical reading of the concept. If we reduce multipolarity to kind of geometry of power and wealth between the US, China, Russia, maybe India or Turkey, I think we miss something crucial. We miss the fact that today, more than ever in history, there is not a coincidence, there is not an overlapping between political spaces and spaces of capital. What matters more is the tension between these different spaces. And this tension makes the definition, the geographical, the cartographic definition of a pole particularly difficult. You know, there are cartographic exercises that aim at representing the multipolar world according to the same logic used to represent the international world, with clearly traced boundaries. But we insist on the contrary, on the fact that the geography of multipolarity, to use the words of Evelina before, is fuzzy and messy, is characterized by continuous overlappings, between different kind of poles. This is the reason why, theoretically, Brett and I say that what really matters is the process of pole formation, which is not a closed process. It is an ongoing process, I repeat, characterized by overlappings. And it is particularly looking at these overlappings that multipolarity can provide occasions, resources, chances for economic development to, a country like Georgia, for instance. Precisely because, as far as I understand from what I read, the infrastructural projects that Evelina mentioned before are kind of located at the intersection between different actors and different kind of operations. You know what comes to my mind is a discussion I had last September with people very close to the Brazilian government, who were saying if we take seriously the challenge of multipolarity, we have to acknowledge that in Brazil, as well as in Latin America as a whole, we are confronted with the presence, with the historical presence, as we know, of the United States, and with the increasing presence of China. What should we do? Should we make a decision between these two supposed poles? We think that it would be much better, to negotiate relations, to play sometimes US against China and the other way around, in order to open windows of opportunity for the economic development of our country. I think, keeping in mind, of course, the peculiarity of Brazil, which is a kind of continental state, part of the BRICS and so on. I think this is a good instantiation of the potentialities and also of the tricky nature of multipolarity.
I'm going to say something and then pass it on to Lela, which I imagine wants to say something similar. But, I think this is an interesting perspective and definitely one, I completely share the rejection of an understanding of multipolarity, which begets a decision between, allying with one, power or the other. And I do think that it's important to, an analysis of the conditions, the specific material conditions of this multipolarity also will allow for certain kinds of potentially strategic positioning. But I do think that, from the perspective of Georgia, which is a very small country, the possibilities of this positioning are very, very, very narrow, in the sense that what seems to happen is that different actors essentially, there is an option between, unfavorable conditions on one side and unfavorable conditions on the other side. And especially in regards to environmental questions, in regards to questions of labor, in regards of questions of community autonomy. So so basically I think this is so if we, for example, let's take a concrete example. So the Port of Anaglia, which was developed between 2017 and 2020 by a consortium, which was a kind of multinational consortium led by Georgia with US investors, essentially. After the failure of this project, which failed because of the inability of the consortium to attract enough international investment, and that also was related to the unwillingness of the Georgian government to subscribe to the risking practices. So that project failed because of this inability to actually fulfill what are the financial demands of international actors, which are demands that inevitably kind of undermine the kind of development of local actors. But now this project is being reactivated by the biggest construction company of the BRI, like a Chinese state kind of arm's length company, and we don't know what the conditions of this new development will be. So I don't want to make predictions, but but judging by other developments that are being made in the country, what we see is, unfortunately, is almost like one of those memes that you kind of like raise the veil and it's always the same thing. So what we see is that what's being proposed is essentially exploitation of labor, exploitation of lands, always the same formula, and that Georgia is essentially forced, or maybe not forced, but like it becomes very difficult to imagine a way in which a country like Georgia could ever position itself in advantageous position within something like multipolarity.
Very, very quickly. I think this is true for most nation states in the world. And this is the reason why such a kind of strategy as the one I was foreshadowing before cannot be a national strategy. This is true even for Brazil. You need larger spaces. You need a transnational politics in order to make such a strategy viable. And for me, a transnational politics must be, first of all, a politics of struggles, a politics driven by the claims of social movements. I perfectly know that this may sound kind of completely unrealistic under the current conditions, but we have to be aware of the fact that it is the only option, I think.
Probably because of having some kind of global order and rules, our movements became a bit softer, and now all of it is collapsing, and we have to come up with new kinds of approaches, and like maybe even more self-sacrifice, or are we just doomed for being under the rule of capital from now on?
You know, that's a difficult question. In general, I agree, but maybe we should also try to move beyond the very language of advanced development, backwardness, and so on. Because as far as I understand, in Georgia, as in many other places in the world, you are confronted with a kind of combination of very high-level operations of capital and wastelands, economic, social, and even political wastelands. And so it is this combination maybe that we have to reflect upon in order to test our political strategies.
I would ask, what would you mean by that, especially the wasteland part? And I would add one more question. Now that we've been talking more about multipolarity and how this most likely is not or how it is most likely very hard, if not impossible, for very small countries to navigate this painlessly. I want to bring up one more concept that you have been working with co-authors, and that's extractivism. We have been, together with my colleague Alexandra Aroshvili, working with the concept, especially to look into the politics of renewables. And this is one more, say, infrastructural sector that is tied to the imagination of transit corridor that Georgia kind of tries to promote itself with or through. The very recent, say, new imagination on this energy transit hub and corridor lines is Europe's undersea submarine cable between Georgia and Armenia that should transport electricity from Azerbaijan towards Hungary. This is a project that, as you can imagine, will be very fuzzy. We don't know if it will materialize, but in the region, so in Caucasus, and particularly also within Georgia, it has certainly stirred imaginations within each three of the countries that they can produce more and export more energy to Europe. This is again connected to the war in Ukraine, or on Ukraine, because it has been Europe's desperate search for new energy sources that has brought us to the situation that the discussion on this type of extremely complex and expensive submarine cable is there. In particular, in Georgian context, this is very closely connected to hydropower. Hydropower is also, and this is where we also come to ground this discussion in the discussion on movements. This is a project that Georgian government, in collaboration with mostly Western, right, mostly predominantly Western actors, both political actors like the US and the European Union in terms of shaping institutional, say, field, but also Western financial actors like European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These have been promoting development of hydropower infrastructures, and we are talking of really quite spectacular scale, right? In the past decade and a half, Georgia has signed over 200 memorandums of understanding, so 200 agreements with various actors to build new hydropower. They now promise 200 more to be implemented in the coming years till 2030. They promise to double generation capacity till 2030 so that they're able to export this electricity. And we are talking of a country where electricity consumption, or which consumes electricity, which is 70-80% already produced within Georgia, and primarily relying on what, again, if we can consider hydro in this case renewable, Georgia is already quite self-sufficient, so it's producing quite a lot. This is what we've been trying to understand as basically an extractivist project, which exposes all and every major valleys in the country to development of hydropower. The ones that have already been developed are usually very dramatic. They are usually hurting locally communities and ecosystems. Waters are being lost. Places are becoming more and more unstable, seismically unstable. People are afraid of landslides. They can't let their kids go to school safely, etc., etc. And this is going on, I mean, in this tiny country, pretty much across the, in entire country space. And this is what is proposed to be accelerated through the cable. And this is where actually one of the key resistance sites, besides also some of the mining regions that be beyond the capital, in the Georgian context, we've witnessed serious place-based social movements that have been opposing hydropower development. So when you mentioned that there needs to be politics, for me, it's not only class politics or mobilization of workers, but it's also a lot of politics of local communities that are struggling to protect themselves from very brutal forms of enclosures and commodification of nature and commodification of life that they're living. So this is just to give this kind of story and to ask you to bring in the concept of extractivism. Again, if you wish to locate it in the multipolar story, but also beyond it, and how you think it structures peripheralized places like Georgia, but as you're arguing, also just global capitalism today more broadly.
Yes, let me start with two short clarifications. When I was talking about multipolarity, I was kind of criticizing a linear geopolitical understanding of the notion. But of course, this does not mean that geopolitics does not have an important role to play in multipolarity. So in many parts of the world, you see that the interest and actions of big states are kind of defining features of the landscape of multipolarity, of the way in which multipolarity hits the ground. I could provide many instances. The second clarification regards the use of the notion or of the word wasteland. And by wasteland, I simply refer to the proliferation of abandoned spaces and territories, again in many parts of the world. And this proliferation is not the opposite of development. This is the important point, because what you were saying, talking about hydropower, is precisely that a specific project of development produces wastelands. And it is against this connection, articulation between development and production of wastelands that the local communities struggle. And I agree with you. This form of resistance, these multifarious forms of resistance that you find in many places. I think of Latin America because it's a region I know pretty well, but it's not only Latin America, are an important, a crucial aspect of the contemporary composition, let's put it so, of what I was calling before a politics of struggles. If we reflect a bit more on this connection between development, specific forms of development, and production of wastelands, we have an angle to bring in the notion of extractivism. And this is because the specific form of development that you were describing with respect to hydropower in Georgia is a peculiarly extractivist form of development. I think it makes sense to oppose extraction and production, although I am also convinced that from a theoretical point of view, this opposition can be misleading. It can be misleading because it tends to kind of miss the contribution of extraction to gigantic processes of valorization of capital, But nonetheless, there is a difference between extraction and production. And in particular, I was struck many years ago when I started to work on extraction and extractivism by reading an old book by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It struck me because Rodney speaks of purely extractivist forms of economic development, stressing that such forms necessarily imply a high degree of violence and dispossession. I think it is also important to reflect upon this idea of a purely extractivist mode of development to make some distinctions. The point is not extraction in itself. Most civilizations in the history of mankind extracted the resources. The point is the way in which extraction is pursued, B, the kind of position of extraction within economy writ large. And nowadays, again, in different parts of the world, we are confronted with economies that are in a way reduced to extractivism. And I repeat with Rodney that an economy reduced to extractivism cannot but be predicated on a high degree of violence and dispossession. This is true with respect to, let's say, natural resources. But as you were mentioning before, in my work with Brett Nilsson, but also in my work with Veronica Gago, an Argentinian scholar and feminist activist, I've kind of stressed the fact that we should take seriously an expansion of the notion of extraction. And if you think of the contemporary discussion of data, of so-called platform capitalism, of big tech, well, we are talking about forms of economic activity, processes of valorization of capital that are predicated upon extraction. Not extraction of natural data if you look at their operations, natural resources. But then you immediately discover that the very existence of digital platform is predicated upon an unprecedented extension of circuits of extraction of specific minerals that make those operations possible. So it's a kind of very general element that characterizes contemporary capitalism. It's a kind of primacy of extraction that many scholars, activists, describe through the angle of a generalization of rent, of the becoming rent of surplus value, and again, an economy, a capitalist economy based on the primacy of rent is an economy that very easily nurture forms of authoritarianism, to go back to the first question.
And this way we come back to Georgi's introduction, right, with the deepening of forms of violence also in Georgian context. In Georgian hydropower context too, your work has been also very important for us and work of others, where the extraction is linked to further processes. From your perspective to financialization, we have been looking at the specific form of it together with Evelina and Alexandra to de-risking. And this is what ultimately and utterly assures that value flows out when the state has committed to essentially remove any financial risk from the projects, and causes also something very spectacular from our perspective, but we know that it's very generalized in terms of phenomena, that projects fail, infrastructural projects fail, and private companies still manage, due to de-risked contracts, to drain out value from specific economies. And this is the value that is behind which there is other processes of extraction. And another form of it, now that you mentioned data centers and so on, in Georgian contracts, it's just very interesting with hydropower that crypto mining comes in. And crypto mining is yet another form of relying on very cheaply produced electricity and cheap electricity, relying on tax exemptions to produce crypto that essentially leaves no value behind locally, right? So yeah, it's a complex story. What if I have time, wanted to also ask you to bring up is that development of these renewables, even if sadly in specific contexts like Georgia, is unfolding on very extractivist terms, can we still and nevertheless imagine development of renewables or alternative energy sources that are not unfolding on extractivist terms, and what would be these alternative terms? If you would be up for bringing that up.
I think this should be a crucial aim of a counter politics of development in Georgia, no less than in other places. In 2022, Michael Hart and I spent a couple of weeks in Bolivia working with social movements and also with a couple of people close to the government of the MAS, the movement towards socialism. And one of the main issues we discussed was lithium. And Bolivia has really gigantic reserves of lithium. The most important reserve is very high in the Andes, in the mountains, in an unpopulated area. So you don't have the problem, of dispossession of specific communities, indigenous communities, but nonetheless you have a lot of other problems. First of all, you have to be aware of the fact that extracting lithium is not easy. It requires technical skills and huge investments in technology. And so the progressive government of Bolivia started some years ago to consider the possibility of a joint venture with a foreign company. And there was a discussion about the terms of the agreement with this foreign company. I think this discussion that involves both the government and indigenous movements of the region was a very interesting one. It was very interesting because it aimed to set a number of political principles that should regulate the agreement. And moreover, there was a discussion about what to do with the Bolivian lithium. Should we simply export our lithium, or should we start to process lithium in the country? You can imagine that this is a quite interesting question with respect to what you were saying, because there were alternative views, particularly in the movement. There were people who said, it's okay, let's export lithium. We do not want new industrial plants in our region. But there were other people who said, if we continue to simply export lithium, we reproduce the relation of dependency toward the world market, And so let's try. So I think to provide a tentative answer to your question, that we should not be afraid to engage in these kind of difficult debates. And of course, the engagement depends on the conditions of possibility that are given in a specific moment, in a specific place. But in general, I think that, how can I say, I put it in a kind of provocative way, reappropriating the issue of development should be one of our aims. It's provocative because, as you know, particularly in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, there has been a long tradition of critique of the notion of development, a very important tradition of critique. And if I say let's reappropriate the notion and the politics of development, I do not discard that critique. I do that on the basis of that critique.
When we see that these war regimes are getting activated here and there, and there is the rise of authoritarianism, and there comes the need of some kind of class struggle or struggle from below, in order to push all this on some kind of progressive way of development, as we say it. In this picture, I think we need some kind of international movements to get entangled with each other. Especially, there is a need for the smaller countries, social movements in these kind of tiny nations. And do you see any signs of the movements that we had 100 years ago reappearing on the field of international politics, and can they impact this global crisis and conflicts that are going on, the conflicts that we don't know how far they can take us if they are not stopped with some kind of alternative view on the world?
It is very difficult to suggest kind of predictions for the next future, particularly in a moment like this one that is characterized by a breathtaking pace of events, developments, transformations at the international scale. I can say that I see all the threats and the dangers that haunt our present conjuncture. If you think of President Trump's initiatives in international politics, and particularly with respect to the two big wars of recent years, Ukraine and Gaza, it is easy to think that is laying the groundwork for a further proliferation of the war regime. And more generally, how can we make sense of Trump's foreign politics? Maybe it has no sense, maybe there is no rationality at all, but we have to look for a kind of principle of rationality. And in this sense, I would say that, first of all, Trump has taken stock of the end of US-American global hegemony. It's very clear that he is not interested in hegemony at all, and that what he has in mind is a reorganization of the space of projection of American economic power that is definitely huge, but not identified with, let's say, the world market, with the global dimension. And secondly, what he seems to be trying to do is to turn such a space in the making into a block, which means also stressing the identification between US capital and the US projection of power. And this is, particularly threatening, meaning that if such a trend is followed by other great powers, we can really find ourselves in a situation of confrontation between blocks. And confrontation within blocks means war, cold or hot war, but war. In such a situation, what I can say is that we have to insist on the need of a new form of internationalism. I don't think we can imagine the comeback of the movements of 1 century ago, because the world has changed, because capitalism has changed, because class struggle itself has changed very much. But we have to insist on the building of bridges, of channels of communication and translation between struggles that take place in different parts of the world. I think this is our task.
Can I add something onto this, which could, what you just said, which is could be a very beautiful conclusion, but I want to allow you to be a conclusion because I need to add something. I feel, also to kind of like summarize some of the key points that we made in this discussion. I think, so if this discussion started with the idea that we were trying to put in focus what the contours are of this new conjuncture, in terms of the role of war and in terms of this emerging multipolarity and the kind of place of Georgia within these different geometries. But then, the discussion continued by looking at the different ways in which if you look at the different struggles on the ground in Georgia, and Lela, for example, mentioned all of the struggles around hydropower, and there is a very concrete attempt in Georgia right now to think through a different mode of development. So Lela's, the group that Lela is part of, the Fair Energy Politics Collective, does exactly that. And similarly, the movements on the ground that are emerging in the aftermath of the elections are grappling with these questions. But then I think, when you speak about a different kind of internationalism, I do think that as well in that there are some, maybe hope is too big a word, but there are some important moves that are being made. So, which also help us rethink these past 30 years of, of kind of post-Soviet, reconstruction and new capitalist conjuncture in Georgia. And I think so. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the signing of what is known as the contract of the century, which is the contract that gave rise to the BTC pipeline, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. So this pipeline, at the time in which this contract was signed, was the longest oil pipeline in the world, and the contract was signed between Azerbaijan and Turkey for the development of this pipeline. So the US was a crucial actor in mediating this contract, and the pipeline, crucially, after quite a bit of struggle internally, passed through Georgia. So this pipeline very much. So I think it's important to think about the timing of this contract. So we are in 1994, so like 3 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this was hailed as the biggest developmental shift that would very much set the stage for a new politics of this region. So now, 30 years after, we see that the politics, geopolitics, geoeconomics, internal politics, that this, that emerges in the aftermath of this contract is a politics of what we've just described. So an intersection between extractivism, financial subordination, and the rippling effects of how this essentially extractive economy has reshaped Georgian politics. But now I think we can start from this pipeline and from this contract to actually rethink of a different kind of internationalism. So from London the other day, I went to this meeting for this group, which is called Energy Embargo for Palestine. And one of the things that they've done is to very much trace the supply chain of oil that feeds the genocide in pipeline. And to no surprise, in Palestine, to no surprise, this pipeline is one of the key, the key infrastructure that provides oil to Palestine. So I think that analyzing this different intersection can also give us some of the contours of what this new internationalism looks like. So the single infrastructure connects Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey with Palestine, and connects activists and social movements in London with the struggles on the ground in these different sites. So in many ways, it kind of provides us a kind of infrastructural connection upon which we can build, we can connect situated struggles from the multiple poles of this global order that is emerging. So I think I wanted to mention this because sometimes when we talk about, internationalism, we can, for those of us involved in different struggles on the ground, and for those of us that are kind of constantly grappling with the complexities of these struggles, it might be feel quite easy to feel quite defeated about the possibilities of actually connecting these struggles. And this work of translation that you talk about, Sandro, is very important, because translation is where it's at in many ways. Like, how do different things make sense in different contexts? But I think it's also important to see that there are successful attempts at kind of laying the base of this internationalism, which involve us all. So all of us involved in this call are engaged in this kind of opposition. So yeah, I wanted to mention this to conclude on a practical with a practical example. But yeah, thank you.
That's a wonderful example. Just let me say that you got one of the most important points when reflecting upon new forms of internationalism, which means that we have to go beyond the opposition between internationalism and grounded struggles. I mean, it is precisely against the background of grounded struggles that new forms of internationalism become necessary and possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope it worked.
Yeah,